Albert Hofmann, of course, is famous for having discovered LSD. If I recall correctly, they were actually looking for a variant compound to treat migraines. And so they were looking at various derivatives of ergot fungus, which is fungus that grows on rye. There are in fact some theories that if you know about the witch hysteria, the Salem witch hysteria that happened in the 1600s, there are some theories that actually may have been a function of getting basically ergot poisoning. So people were sort of getting a low dose of LSD in their bread. So they were looking at these compounds to treat. And he absorbed an extremely tiny dose of one of these compounds, and it had an incredibly outsized effect. They were not prepared for sort of the potency, and realizing that he was, feeling a bit under the weather, he decided to ride his bike home, and that's sort of the first LSD trip in history.
Welcome to the Manifested Wellbeing podcast. I'm Leandro, your host. Today's guest is Anderson Todd. He is the Assistant Director of the University of Toronto's Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory. He teaches both cognitive science and interdisciplinary courses in Jungian Theory, lecturing on both the consciousness and the unconscious. Mr. Todd, thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks, Leandro. Glad to be on.
To start with our conversation, could you please talk about the work you do on CWSL, what it entails?
Sure. So the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory at the University of Toronto, as you mentioned, I'm the assistant director. The director is John Vervaeke, who was a guest on your show before. And John and I have a long working relationship. We, in fact, founded the lab together now 7 years ago. And originally, we were actually interested in looking at sort of altered states broadly and how those things impact on certain issues within cognitive science. And initially, in fact, we were looking at doing research around lucid dreaming. I have some background research in that and had designed a kind of experiment that we were interested in conducting. And there was no real laboratory at the University of Toronto that sort of was on board with this sort of work. And I had proposed to him, I was like, the answer to this is we should obviously set up a laboratory where we can start looking at some of the stuff that we're interested in. So, our general mandate, kind of the umbrella of stuff that we deal with a lot of material around altered states and higher states of consciousness, so mystical states of consciousness, et cetera. We're very interested in flow. We're very interested in insight, lucid dreaming, sort of dimensions of the religious or spiritual experience, and then how those things cash out in terms of, actual cognitive science theory. So not merely just what's happening with the brain, but some of the deeper interdisciplinary sort of implications of that. So we've done research sort of on all sorts of things. The most recent paper that we have is on the relationship between mystical experience and meaning in life. We found some quite interesting results around that. But as I said, it's a pretty wide umbrella. Wisdom and consciousness, it lets us cover quite a lot.
Okay, and how did you get interested in consciousness-altering substances in the first place?
Well, so in no small part, my own interest in that goes back to, my own parents were sort of children of the 60s. So I grew up with, a fair bit of the kind of 60s literature around the house, Doors of Perception, Aldous Huxley. And so at a young age, I was fascinated by some of the work that had happened in the 50s and 60s around hallucinogens specifically. And I had read all of these accounts. Now, obviously, at the time, this is like the post-Nixon era. So all of that stuff was totally illegal and very forbidden. But it seemed like there was sort of a body of research that had been quite promising before the hammer got dropped on it. And I was always fascinated by the promise that held out before, sort of the authoritarian machine decided to shut it down. As I, got deeper into my own research, I was interested in non-invasive brain stimulation. And I got quite interested in sort of meditation and various methods of using techniques rather than substances or technology. So I just got generally interested in sort of consciousness alteration. And when I came back around to this material and started doing some of the research, I was amazed to find, some of the results before everything had been canned, They had been doing work with in Canada with LSD and alcoholism, where they were showing this incredible rate of recovery for alcoholism and other forms of addictions. And then I had a series of encounters where I met people who, had used, various substances, legal and illegal, and by their accounts of things, it being just such a tremendously transformative experience. And in some cases, people describing it as being, among the most, transformative, significant experiences of their lives. So that got my attention around that stuff, initially speaking. And the deeper I dug in on the literature, the more I realized that, as many people have, right, with the psychedelic renaissance, this has gotten a really big resurgence of research attention in the last 10 to 15 years. But it just seemed like there was a huge sort of body of potential material here for self-transformation and for learning about consciousness in the brain that we had sort of dropped. And now we had better tools and sort of a better framework to look at it without, being panicked, kind of thing. So that was definitely my own interest. Research-wise, actually, I got involved not with any of the conventional psychedelics, but with, it's not very well known, with an African plant called Iboga Tabernanthe. Do you know this one?
I don't. Oh.
So it's quite rare. It's unusual, but so the thing with Iboga that got my interest was it's banned in the States, but it's legal in Canada, where we are. And in the 1960s, there was a chap named Howard Lotzoff who was kind of working his way through Europe and North Africa, basically taking every drug he could get his hands on. And he was in, I think, Gabon. So this plant grows in Gabon and Cameroon and some parts of Congo. And he had this initiation drug, this substance, which is used in its indigenous context for like initiation ceremonies. And after 3 days of being in this intense altered state, he woke up on the far side to discover that he was no longer addicted to heroin, and that it had sort of canceled out his addiction almost completely and been this really sort of transformative experience. Now, since that time, there have been quite a few people that have used it. It's become a sort of an underground method of treatment that seems to combine together this sort of, the mind-altering component with some kind of physiological components that seem to handle addictive processes, a bit like ayahuasca. People seem to use ayahuasca in similar ways. But I became quite interested in that about 10 years ago when I was investigating. This always sounds a little weird when I say it. I was looking into potential treatments for love sickness. And I had the research intuition that love sickness, when we experience it, right, which we've pretty much all experienced, you think about the horrible feeling that comes from being lovesick, and it's, this kind of craving and bargaining and obsessive ideation, and it affects your sleep and it affects your mood. And I just had the intuition when I was thinking about it, and I was like, this is a biochemical withdrawal problem. It's an addiction, basically. And this particular substance, Iboga Tabernanthe, seems to operate on a lot of different addictions. It for however the mechanism is functioning, and that there's not a lot known about it, it seems to be very broad spectrum. And so I began to wonder whether or not it couldn't be used for that. And indeed, it does show some promise in that direction. So that in turn got me into the more general idea of to what extent can these substances be sort of brought in from the cold and incorporated into a system of, wellness, mental health, and sort of therapeutic treatment. So that was sort of my port of entry. And then, as things have become legitimized through research in the States, the Griffiths Lab and work being done in Switzerland, and Robin Carhart Harris, and now there's been just a huge explosion of this stuff. It's amazing. I never would have predicted it, actually. 15 years ago, I never would have predicted it.
So yes, that's true, because recently I was reading that the Denver City in the U.S. Apparently it voted to decriminalize psilocybin mushrooms, and books about this topic are being written and research is being done as well. You commented the work, you read lots of works in the 60s, and then you have the pre and post Nixon era. If you could focusing on the therapeutic use of hallucinogens, could you please give us a historical background, starting from the research done by Hoffman and Osmond, or any way you think relevant to start?
Yeah, so Albert Hofmann, of course, is famous for having discovered LSD. If I recall correctly, they were actually looking for a variant compound to treat migraines. And so they were looking at various derivatives of ergot fungus, which is a fungus that grows on rye. There are, in fact, some theories that if you know about the witch hysteria, the Salem witch hysteria that happened in the 1600s, there's some theories that actually may have been a function of getting basically ergot poisoning. So people were sort of getting a low dose of LSD in their bread. So they were looking at these compounds to treat. And he absorbed an extremely tiny dose of one of these compounds, and it had an incredibly outsized effect. They were not prepared for sort of the potency, and realizing that he was, feeling a bit under the weather, he decided to ride his bike home, and that's sort of the first LSD trip in history. Now, they were looking at, obviously, medical applications initially, but pretty quickly as researchers started to look at that, at mescaline, at magic mushrooms, so psilocybin, various sort of off-the-books researchers were beginning to do things with psychedelic psychotherapy. And so there are some sort of, like I mentioned, they used LSD in combination with alcoholism, so somebody would get a large dose and then sort of process through, in the course of their experience, the roots of their alcoholism, the roots of their addiction. And in fact, in later stages, you began to see the application of other substances. So there were some protocols that got used in the 60s where both the therapist and the client were taking, like the therapist themselves was taking a low dose. I can't imagine that getting through ethics these days, but it was a looser era. And in fact, there were subsequent sort of experimental works done, especially in the late 70s and early 80s around MDMA, which, ecstasy, which we think of as a club drug, but actually was used for quite a bit of psychotherapy and especially couples therapy. When they finally outlawed it in 1982, there was an open letter from Claudio Naranjo and a bunch of the other people working with it, basically begging the FDA, please don't take this away from us. It's such a breakthrough tool. And it's amazing, actually, you're seeing that make a comeback too, of all things, sort of funded largely by the Pentagon, who wants to use it to treat PTSD, right? So yeah, there was quite a bit of early work around combining it together. The idea being that when you are in one of these altered states, it's often easier to access certain kinds of emotional material, but also the way that the functioning of the brain changes under the influence of different substances means that you're sort of getting access to parts of your personality and parts of your sort of psychological material that you wouldn't normally have easy access to. And so that sort of underlies much of the functioning. And with some of them, there's a sharp reduction in anxiety. So with MDMA specifically, like when they give that to soldiers with PTSD, the idea is that instead of being stuck in the loop that you're in, where it's like you're reliving the various traumas of being in the battlefield, you can experience those events, but they don't have the same kind of anxious grab. And so you process them through and thus change your relationship to them. Likewise, when we see MDMA applied in couples therapy, very often it enables people to open themselves up without anxiety in a way that allows them to communicate their feelings right back and forth, and they don't feel freaked out by the way that, frankly, normally people have a hard time expressing. So, but of course, yeah, as I mentioned, the Nixon administration kind of flipped out and dropped the hammer on almost all of this stuff, right? It was more or less completely banned for research for years and years and years. So it's just now starting to kind of come out of that.
This was in the U.S. How was it in the Canada? Did it happen the same time as well with restrictions as it happened in the United States?
Yes, to some extent, but it sort of depends on the substances in question. So generally Health Canada, which is the governing body for this kind of thing, will follow the lead of the FDA. Mm-hmm. And so there was a long period of time actually where we were really hand in hand. Actually, a lot of this research was conducted in Canada. It was not uncommon for researchers to come up from the States and do stuff in Canada for whatever reason. And so a lot of this research occurred in Montreal. There was quite a bit, but a lot of it got done here. Generally speaking, when the States banned it, we banned it, but there are a few notable exceptions. So Iboga, for instance, which I already mentioned, was never illegal here. In the States, it is a top scheduled drug, meaning it has no medicinal use, and it's highly subject to like addiction, which I can't think of something further from the truth. It just kind of got scooped up, and it didn't here. I would say that on the whole, Canadian drug policy has overall been slightly more permissive. A lot of the more modern research chemicals and stuff have been sort of allowed to roll out. We were a little quicker to decriminalize, but for instance, if you look at the legalization of marijuana, right, that happened federally here relatively recently across the country, but individual states were doing it a number of years ago, and so there's a bit of a back and forth. But I would say that on the whole, we're slightly less restrictive.
Okay, I would like to get back in Ergot and explore this a little bit. If you could, I believe that it's not such a common knowledge. If you could talk about what the ergot is, the relationship with wheat or barley, that if you have a different type of weather, you may end up having something that has this specific.
Sure. Okay, so I'll forewarn you. I'm neither a farmer nor a botanist, so take it with a grain of salt. But it's a fungus, and it grows on the kernels of rye, which is a form of wheat. I think I'm not a botanist or a farmer, but it's a form of grain, right? So you would use it to make rye bread, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a fungus which grows within the kernels, and it has a small amount of a psychoactive substance. I think it contains LSA, which is closely chemically related to LSD. It's not nearly as strong. And in fact, ergot extracts are still used medicinally for certain things. So they do, in fact, use them for migraine, and there are cases where they use them for epilepsy as well. So the point is that, getting this kind of contamination, if you're harvesting your grain, right, you're grinding up the bread, you're getting a certain amount in the bread. Effectively speaking, the idea is that you're sort of getting like a microdose, as they say, of the drug, enough to alter your state maybe slightly without you even knowing it. That's not a proven hypothesis by any stretch. It's just something that's been proposed, but it is kind of an interesting idea for what might have happened in the whole sort of witch hysteria situation around that.
Okay, and there are consequences as well, physical, because I think that because of the poison of this substance, people, they develop some kind of scars as well, I believe.
I didn't recall that. That's interesting.
Yeah, because I was reading books about people getting poisoned, some old drawings, and the drawings have people some kind of ulcers that it's due to, I believe that's due to this substance as well, long time exposure.
Right. So if they're getting a continuous low dose of it or something. That makes sense in most of these cases. And the same, of course, goes for so many chemicals. But, the fungus or the plant that's growing it it's not growing it for our benefit. Usually it's growing it to get us to back off. And we just figure out, clever ways to get just enough to have it do what we want. So, the dose makes the poison, as they say.
And going back to hallucinogens for therapy, like today, what are the most used substances right now? If you there's the top 3 or the top.
Well, we're in a bit of a transitional phase, which is to say that there has been a renewed interest in the therapeutic use of psychedelics. But this stuff hasn't quite crossed a threshold back into fully accepted, sort of medical use. So there's a lot of debate. There are a series of trials happening. MAPS, which some of your viewers might be familiar with, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Science, is a group. So they're not for profit. They have organized a lot of the efforts to sort of organize large-scale studies. So they're looking at MDMA. They've run some scale studies with ketamine, right, which is originally a tranquilizer. People always joke it's a horse tranquilizer, but it's a dissociative anesthetic tranquilizer that also likewise saw a fair bit of use as kind of a club drug, right, that people use. So, you see it in the rave scene. That's seeing a series of trials for intractable depression, and looks like actually it's quite good. As I mentioned, MDMA for treating persistent anxiety, PTSD, et cetera, et cetera. There has been work in Switzerland, and I think some studies in the States, using LSD in the treatment of death anxiety specifically. So advanced cancer patients in Switzerland were given LSD, and this sort of helped them process through what was happening to them, right? And then there's been a bunch of work recently around psilocybin, which is the main active chemical in magic mushrooms. But because all this is up in the air and it's not quite yet legal, questions about what the protocols are going to be, which substances are going to be used, in what context, what the credentials of the people who are doing this kind of therapy are going to be, it's all really in negotiation. I've been involved with a few conferences and been involved with some groups and things, petitions, talking about trying to figure out what this is going to look like. And, is it going to be just doctors? Hopefully not, since there's never enough doctors to go around. But it's still really very, very much up in the air. I think you're going to see psilocybin, so magic mushrooms, seem to have a pretty persistent usage, and it looks like they have a fairly repeatable effect in terms of treating depression, which of course is gold as far as treatment goes. It looks like the MDMA studies are really pushing ahead, so sort of getting nice pure MDMA. They're in a stage 3 set of clinical trials on human subjects and seeing quite good results. So I think you're going to see that drop fairly soon. Ketamine infusions, at least in Canada, are already leaping ahead. So there are already clinics that are willing to do ketamine infusions for intractable depression, which is amazing. Again, I wouldn't have predicted that 10 years ago. And then some of the more sort of exotic substances, I think, like ayahuasca, right, where the active component is DMT, but there's some other things in there. It's a variety of plants. It's not clear yet how that is going to sort of work its way into the therapeutic context officially. Enough people are interested in it that it's hard to believe it's not going to have some kind of presence. And it's had some very high-profile support. So Dr. Gabor Mate, who's he's a big gun in the addictions field, and he wrote, what's that book called? In the Land of Hungry Ghosts, I think. Is a really quite good book. He's been a big supporter of ayahuasca and was doing quite a bit of work with it in Canada on the West Coast until Health Canada sort of came and said, technically what you're doing is not legal, like you need to back off. So it seems that the community is moving in the direction of using these things, but in terms of what's going to end up being sort of, the accepted practice, it's still a bit up in the air. But, 10 years from now, that may be a very different story.
And at this point, if you're a therapist or research, what's the bureaucratic process that you have to go through to get a license? Because as you talk about ayahuasca, that there are two different plants that you have to put together, and they are not native of North America. There's a whole process of importing, working on them, and then treating people. How do you go through all these steps?
Right. So in the case of ayahuasca specifically, people often say that for Canada, that's a legal gray area. It's not really a legal gray area. It's just illegal. It's just that the authorities aren't, they're not spending the resources to track down people drinking, jungle tea. In terms of running one of these trials, like doing some of the research level things, at this point, it's still quite difficult. In the States, the process by which you have to get one of these substances for clinical trial for humans, there's a level of purity that means you have to source it from certain kinds of labs. Those labs have connections to the FDA. The FDA often slows that process down. So the researchers I know that do work in this area often have a lot of roadblocks as they're trying to get stuff kind of pulled through. But there have been a few researchers that have managed to sort of jump the hurdles. Griffiths, as I mentioned, at Johns Hopkins, has done a bunch of work with psilocybin, and they've managed to get it going. And it seems like, generally speaking, like as the research begins to pile up, a lot of the governing authorities are starting to just be like, oh, okay, like let's just let this happen. And it's starting to get more backing from some of the more conservative outlets. So U of T, colleagues of mine at U of T in York just opened the first center for psychedelic studies, I believe, in the world. And that's at U of T. And U of T normally is a fairly conservative school. They're seldom sort of first out on something that's controversial. So the process right now is still quite involved. But again, I think that as the evidence starts to pile up about how safe, frankly, many of these things are under properly controlled conditions, you're beginning to see a lot of the government authorities make it easier to do it. And it just, there's so much potential in the research, really obviously. And people are just less scared, I think, than they used to be. The old LSD trip gone wrong stories don't have the same kind of weight as they used to.
Very interesting. Could it, before going, because I'm interested in the therapeutic use, specifically treating anxiety and depression, but before, could you talk about specific for psilocybin, how does it act in the brain?
Sure. So that's a complicated subject, obviously. It's doubly complicated. As good as some of the recent science is, the science is very much in its infancy. So, the data that we have out, it looks really impressive, and people publish papers and they have, pictures of brains that are all lit up and stuff. And I don't think people have sometimes a sense of how rudimentary our understanding of the functioning of this stuff is. It's impressive, and we are starting to get some cool results, but it's definitely very early days. So the basics with something like psilocybin, right, is that it's operating in your brain on some of the receptor sites that normally take endogenous neurotransmitters, mostly serotonin. So you normally have receptor sites in your brain that accommodate serotonin. Instead, you ingest psilocybin, it plugs into those sites. In some cases, it's a function of keeping serotonin from plugging in, and in some cases, there's a bunch of different things it does depending on receptor sites. But the receptor side of things is really kind of less interesting than what happens to the brain's activation patterns when the substance is in. So, for instance, Robin Carhart-Harris published a really interesting set of fMRI studies where he was looking at the action of psilocybin. And what he showed, among other things, was that the default mode network, which is, it's kind of a mind-wandering network, was activating in a really different way and was co-activating with other systems that it didn't normally, co-activate with. And also you were getting sort of regions firing simultaneously, that don't normally coordinate their action. So if you think about some of the classic kind of descriptions of psychedelics where people experience, synesthesia, right? So, they're like, oh, I can see the music. And, they're experiencing sort of color or pattern or something in time with what they're listening to. It seems like a big part of what's happening is that these classic psychedelics are allowing areas of the brain that aren't normally in direct communication to come into direct communication, partly by blocking the pathways that they would normally use. So whereas you might normally have a fairly kind of solid and integrated sense of your own self and self-consciousness, that tends to sort of fade away. And instead you're having these direct contacts between different parts of your brain. That then has, of course, all kinds of consequences. So in terms of the sensory and the phenomenological effect, what you experience, you get this like seeing the music or unusual stuff. But consider, when your experience of a sensory quality suddenly connects up with an emotional processing, and you're having all of a sudden a very strong, novel emotional experience, or your different parts of your sense of self are connecting up in ways that they don't normally, or you feel connected to the world, things in your environment that you might not normally, So instead of sort of watching your pet lizard in the tank, you suddenly feel sort of a sense of almost mystical unity with the lizard in the tank, and a dissolution of your own boundaries. And so in the kind of connection and co-firing of the different parts of your brain during the state, you're seeing all kinds of really interesting recombinations of the material in your mind. And that seems to be a really big part of where the effect kind of comes in. Different psychedelics obviously operate, differently, They really do have distinct effects. They're not all the same thing. But, and again, our data is very much, we're just at the start of a lot of this stuff. But even what's been published is really, it's cool. It's just really, really neat. And looking at trying to finally understand how some of these experiences cash out in terms of what's going on in the brain. I don't know. Yeah, I'm enough of a brain nerd and enough of an altered states nerd that it's so exciting for me to see this stuff. I'll just geek out about it all day long. So, yeah.
Wonderful. There is for Dr. Griffith's laboratory, there's a randomized controlled trial. They use high doses of psilocybin, I believe, administered for people with symptoms of anxiety, and it's specific for patients with life-threatening cancer
terminal cancer.
Terminal cancer, yes, terminal cancer. Could you comment on the therapeutical use to treat anxiety and depression and how people come out after being treated?
So it's a little tricky. I mean, anxiety is one of these ones where it goes either way. So right back to some of the early days of psychedelic research, right? Timothy Leary, in fact, who was at Harvard until he wasn't, had terms around controlling the psychedelic experience, or trying to guide it. You can't really control it, but trying to guide it around the concept of set and setting. So the idea being that you want to come in with an appropriate kind of framework, right? Surroundings, right? You want to control your environment a little bit, and the setting really matters, right? So natural settings are good, and sort of, jagged, unnatural settings, difficult people, stressful things, bad, right? And that was kind of the extent of that. Anxiety with psychedelics, classical psychedelics, is really, really influenced by set and setting. And so that tended to be one of these areas where, like, treating an acute anxiety, you can give somebody a psychedelic, and sometimes that makes their anxiety completely melt away. It's just like, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of. But sometimes, actually, it can produce an incredibly intense, very unpleasant experience. And, if for your viewers that have never encountered a state like these, there's no question that these aren't toys, they're tools. And sometimes the experiences that they produce can be, right, like intensely anxious and unpleasant. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that those states aren't still useful. And one of the things that actually has come out of Griffiths, among other things, is even when people have a so-called bad trip, very often they nevertheless describe the experience as being highly significant and useful, right? You got to wonder, when you're trapped sort of in a cage, right, with your own worst fear for 6 hours, well, it's going to change you in one way or another. You're forced to sort of confront something. But that is not usually the experience people are going in for. So anxiety, goes sort of both ways. There are certain substances that seem to be particularly effective at treating it, right? MDMA is really good with anxiety. LSD and psilocybin, it's been very mixed, but it seems like under controlled setting, appropriate setting, right? So you get a doctor, a nice controlled setting, everything is calm, quiet music, soft light, plenty of water. People then seem to have an okay experience. So the incidence of bad trips really drops. In terms of depression, it's not entirely clear yet what it is exactly that's being affected, like why it has an antidepressant effect. So there are a few schools of thought. One is that in mimicking the serotonin system, as I mentioned, it's having something of an effect, and lots of the conventional medications for treating depression also work on serotonin. So SSRIs, right, Prozac and that whole family all operate around serotonin. The thing is that lots of the science that originally thought that, all you needed to do was turn up the serotonin dial to make people happy, all turns out to be, it's wrong. Or I shouldn't say it's wrong. It hasn't replicated well. So it's not totally clear what's going on there. Some of it seems to be a function of, for anyone who's experienced depression, there is a quality to it that is sort of a repetitious. You get caught in certain kinds of loops, right? Your mind is very constricted. You tend not to see possibilities. You tend not to see options. You tend to see things in a very limited world. Your world shrinks, very importantly. And what seems possible and available to you shrinks. And your energy drops and so on and so forth. And you get caught in sort of stereotyped loops in many ways. It's quite possible that one of the reasons that you see so many of these substances with different mechanisms of action all having an effect is that really what they're doing is just disrupting that loop, right? So they just, like, you're caught in a loop and they kind of break that open. And altered states generally seem to have that kind of effect, that kind of impact. All sorts of things can jog somebody out of depression, right? So it's not clear yet how much of the antidepressant effect of these substances is strictly physiological, like how much of it is, it's something happening in the brain, and how much of it has to do with a higher level question around sort of general cognitive patterns. And then, as the research with John Vervaeke and I is sort of pointing towards, it seems like there may be a still higher level that has to do with your sense of meaning, your sense of coherence, and the extent to which your sort of world system, right, begins to have a continuous quality. So mystical experiences, right, are highly predictive, as we've found, of meaning in life. And it seems like that comes through coherence. And likewise, a lot of these substances seem to likewise, they sort of produce the kinds of effects that open you up in this way. So that is not exactly, that's not tic-tacky brain level stuff. And it's not it's cognitive, obviously, right? But it seems to be operating at a higher level, I think, than most clinicians are considering, right? Most clinicians are not looking at the sort of clinical role of mystical experiences, but it seems like that might be one of the big factors in what makes these things useful.
Now I have two follow-ups. But first of all, now I'm thinking we was reading works done by Griffiths as well, and there's I'm thinking about psychedelics and psychological harm after the experience, and there's a small number. If I'm not mistaken, please correct me if I am. There's a small number of people that they reported psychological harm after the experience. And my question would be in the direction of, because now everything is very exciting and but there are many people that they're very interested, but what the type of people that these experiences may not
work for.
It may not be for.
Sure. So the general thing, when I teach this material in my courses, one of the things that I will point out to people, so the one thing that I'll hammer over and over again, and I've been saying for 20 years now, is that they're not toys. They're tools. People they're exciting, and they can be really interesting. And the states that are produced can be extremely novel, and, not just young people, but in particular young people often respond to that stuff by throwing themselves into it. And it's like, right? And the thing is, okay, but what you're dealing with is a very serious change to your mind, right? And it needs to be treated respectfully. It needs to be treated carefully. Not everybody is careful. And to the extent that you're not careful with it, the likelihood that you're going to have a bad experience of some kind obviously goes up. But above and beyond that, yes, some people report lasting, problems of various kinds. There don't seem to be typically health effects per se. Sometimes you get a persistent, what's the name of that syndrome? There's a persistent thing where you might get a persistent visual effect. Some people report that. But there don't typically seem to be health effects per se, psychological effects. My answer to that when people bring that up is, it's not for everybody. What is? Nothing is for everybody. It is a definite serious undertaking. To be involved with some of these substances is, it's not even a treatment. It's an ordeal. You're moving into a space that can be extremely taxing. And if you are already psychologically fragile in one way or another, for instance, if you're prone to psychosis, right? So if you're prone to psychosis or you have latent schizophrenia or anything along those kinds of dimensions, often this stuff can be quite problematic because it can wear down some boundaries that maybe actually need to be a bit more built up. And then there are just cases where, frankly, these things show people things that they don't want to see, right? It can be traumatic like any other experience. So, there are certainly lots of cases on record of people experiencing quite distressing psychological, hallucinatory or just affective, right, experiences, much as they do with any other kind of system or technique where people are altering their mind. Meditation, as an example, is one that I use all the time. There has been a tendency, especially in the last 20 years, with sort of mindfulness to treat meditation as this unadulterated good, right? Mindfulness. People pay less attention to the various instances where meditation can actually cause intense distress, where it can be really difficult for people and lead them into places that they are unprepared for, and that, the class that they took at the local yoga studio did not leave them, right? Ditto, people I've known that have done deep tissue massage or yoga, body work especially, can bring a lot of locked trauma up. And sometimes it's the case that you have a really good instructor who sort of knows how to mediate and manage this sort of thing. But sometimes, you have no idea. So anything really where you're digging around in your own mind and we all have trauma. So the possibility of bringing something like that up and not knowing how it's going to affect you, I think that's always a function. Therapy can be extremely unpleasant for people too. The difference is that you can stop therapy anytime you want, whereas once you've eaten 5 dried grams of mushrooms, the experience is going on until it wants to finish and not necessarily until you want to. It's more like a roller coaster. And everybody who's ever been on a roller coaster, I'm sure, has experienced that thing where they start to come up to the top of the first hill and they say, actually, no, no, I take it back. I actually don't want to be here. I want to go have more cotton. Oh, I guess we're doing this. It has that kind of quality. And once it starts, you're in. Now, that's beneficial in some ways, too. And that's the thing, right? In some cases, psychedelic psychotherapy and psychedelics generally bring you into confrontation with things in your mind, and they don't let you back off. And so that's a mixed bag. It's the kind of thing that can be tremendously beneficial because our desire to look away from things that we don't want to deal with is obviously always high. But by the same token, in some cases, that can be, dangerous. And so that's why it's so important, I think, that unlike in the 60s when things were kind of, the drugs got thrown around. Timothy Leary, God bless him, was, basically sprinkling LSD on his cornflakes and this solves everything. It's like, no, it's a tool and we have to find careful ways of fitting this in. But it does open up sort of potential doors that are so promising that if we can find good, responsible ways to deal with it, yeah, there are risks, but the benefits are enormous.
I would just like to follow up in your comment on meditation and causing distress as well. In Buddhism, I heard a monk commenting, because there are certain types of meditative states in Buddhism that they focus on their body and on the parts of their body. And he said that there's some monks that they get disgust of their body and it can cause negative consequences.
Sure.
Well. So as you said, yes, there are tools and there are consequences if you don't use those tools properly. And another thing that I would like to say about something that I hear a lot about microdosing, and I have even friends of mine as well. One friend of mine, he commented, and they're doing microdosing daily. So I don't know the details, but basically, as I was told, is to increase focus for more focus. I would like to ask you, because I was researching and I couldn't find any,
official research?
Exactly, like a randomized control trial. I couldn't see anything but articles and lots of YouTube videos of people very
enthusiastically talking about how it changed their life.
Yes.
Yeah, so actually we're involved. So the people, Rotem Petrenker and Thomas Anderson, who are at York and U of T respectively, and are colleagues of ours, are involved in the Center for Psychedelic Studies. They're actually looking at doing I believe, the first really controlled, randomized clinical trial specifically studying microdosing. We at the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Laboratory are likewise involved in that study, and we're looking specifically at cognitive factors. So, as I mentioned, right, mystical experiences, insight. We're interested in some of these factors and trying to relate the two things together, but there hasn't been a lot of research. Microdosing, it's funny. We joke at the lab sometimes that microdosing is it's become the mindfulness. A lot of students want to write about it, right? The way that they wanted to write a lot of mindfulness papers 5 or 10 years ago. So it's become very trendy. I have sometimes joked in my classes, it's like, if you want to know the difference between the 60s and now, it's like in the 1960s, people dropped LSD and were like, turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? Throw off the man and ignore authority and grow your hair long. And now it's Silicon Valley, take low doses to increase your productivity as a programmer, right? I got to work a long day at Google. I need some LSD. That's a little glib, and it's not quite true. It does seem like there is some interesting possibility. So Rotem and Thomas did a pretty large online study where they looked at sort of anecdotal reports of people who were microdosing. And it did seem like there were some interesting things that came out of that. Towards the end of his life, actually, Albert Hofmann who you mentioned, the inventor of LSD, actually had come to believe that microdosing probably was the sort of frontier. And there are lots of people who anecdotally, and anecdote is not the kind of thing that you build policy on, but it definitely is the thing that points an arrow towards research, right? You don't ignore anecdote. If lots of people are anecdotally saying, hey, let me throw away my ADHD medication, it's like, okay. And sometimes people are surprised by this. They're like, whoa, but why would drugs? And it's like, what do you think ADHD medication is? It's drugs. It's speed. So, you're tweaking some neurotransmitter or other. The question is like, okay, what are you tweaking and why? So, when we have people on large amounts of amphetamine or of something like Ritalin, which is basically a close analog of cocaine, they're both dopamine drugs, right? Instead, people are claiming that low doses of this stuff increases focus, increases flow, et cetera, seems to have antidepressant effects. Lots of anecdotal data, obviously, but yeah, the sort of double-blind controlled studies, they're still in the pipe. So we are involved in trying to set that stuff up. The legislative and sort of, right, the bureaucratic hurdles basically are what are slowing this down. Funding and interest definitely seems to be there, although there are some groups within the psychedelic field that are sort of trying to kind of capitalistically corner the market, and that's causing some problems. So there are people trying to corner the market on magic mushrooms and psilocybin, and I have opinions about that are distinct from science, but I don't think it makes for good science when we corner markets on things. Yeah, so microdosing is very much in the rage, but right now it's just like a giant uncontrolled anecdotal experiment. If something comes out of it, great. And it seems like lots of people are sort of saying, hey, this is worth paying attention to. But yeah, we're going to have to wait for the real science to come down the pipe. I'm interested, and I suspect that there is something there. I have come to be interested in threshold and microdoses of substances generally rather than large doses. But I actually think that both things will end up having a useful functional role. I think that small doses of things will tweak, small factors, right, kind of loosen things up. But the role of a large, so-called flood dose of a substance, I suspect is not going to go away. But I could be wrong. It's always possible that we've just been radically overdoing things in the field for years and years, and that microdosing is the way to go. I don't know. That's the great thing about science. It has a way of violating your intuitions, and it's always surprising. So we'll see where that goes.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great. I have still a bunch of questions for you, and
Yeah.
I'm also aware of your time as well. About Jungian theory, because you're working with Jungian theory, I'm very interested, and I will try to get at least this interview on psychedelics, not diverge. How can Jungian theory be used as a tool in treatments with psychedelics on your experience?
Okay, well, so I am, to split hairs really finely, I'm a neo-Jungian. So I'm a big fan of Jung, Carl Jung, for those who are familiar with his work. But there is a kind of strain in the Jungian community that I guess I would call the orthodox Jungians. These are the people that are like, Carl wrote 23 books of material and that's the gospel, the end. I don't hold to that position. I think that he's a human being, and like every other human being, at least 50% of what he wrote was wrong. But the things that he gets down are really clever. So very often I think that in Jungian theory, this is sort of the work that I do, integrating together Jungian theory and the cognitive science research that I do. A lot of the time, Carl Jung's observations and descriptions of human psychology are spot on. He was an excellent clinician, and he was an extremely observant he was an extremely observant clinician, right? He paid close attention to his own mental states and the psyche of his clients. But his explanations for what was happening, I think, are often off base. And he was doing the best he could with the science between, 1913 and 1965 kind of thing. But the point is, I don't think his explanations a lot of the time are correct, right? The way that he thinks things are working, I think, is not quite right. Nevertheless, a lot of psychology has kind of taken Freud and Jung and a lot of the people who were early psychodynamic theorists, it's thrown it all away. And I think that's premature. I think that rather what we want to do is take a look, see whether or not some of these phenomena that people describe are indeed occurring, and it seems to me they are, and then try to find, what mechanisms within the current science, cognitive science we have, so brain science and various theories that we have access to now, can explain some of those mechanisms, if that makes sense. So the role of psychedelics in this, so I differ from Carl Jung in this extent. He was sort of anti-psychedelics. He thought that basically popping the lid on your unconscious mind, was not a great idea. So he thought that using drugs in this way was sort of getting ahead of yourself, and you should let things unfold naturally through process. I don't agree. I think that every human culture on record uses altered states in some way to alter their mind, often in a sacred or spiritual context. Most, although not all, of them use substances in some way. It's so widespread that obviously it has early human antecedents. And now we're starting to see lots of evidence that the use of these substances really alters the functioning of the mind in ways that can be quite beneficial, right? So like Griffiths, for instance. So I think that the integration between these things eventually will be that, and this is something actually that John Vervaeke and I talk about a fair bit, much of the material that gets brought up in the course of a psychedelic experience is, for lack of a better term, archetypal, right? You experience a lot of extremely powerful charged imagery. And a lot of it can be categorical. So with descriptions of ayahuasca, for instance, if you read the descriptions of these things, people are having these cosmic, expansive experiences of reality and gods and mystic jaguars. And how do you make sense of any of this stuff? Well, I would say that a sort of neo-Jungian approach, and this is the approach I take, is this level of your mind, right? This evolved level of your mind and of culture is always operating in us. And it obviously is. We, as secular a society, for instance, as North America claims to be, the fact that we are all packing into the theaters to go to superhero movies day in and day out, right, is the clearest possible indication to me that we have not left the gods behind. We're just uncomfortable with the form our churches have taken, right? We're uncomfortable with the politics of religion. But the kind of basics around religion keep shape-changing on us, but they never really go away. The gods, whatever you may think of them metaphysically, are always with us psychologically. And sort of that's Jung's position too. It's like, ultimately speaking, the existence or non-existence of spiritual reality, such as it is, isn't an answerable question. It's impossible to know, right, in a technical, rational sense about the existence of God. How would you prove or disprove it? But that doesn't matter. That's the core of the Jungian thinking. The fact is that you have to deal with this level of reality because it's part of the operating system of your mind. And psychedelics give a very they break in through this rational framework and sort of give people access to this in a way that they don't normally have. And of all of the various sort of early formative psychodynamic theorists, in my opinion, Jung is the theorist who takes most seriously sort of the realm of the soul. So without making any claims about sort of the soul as a ghost that lives in your body, he deals really directly with this sort of spiritual experience, with this, right, these sort of metaphysical, mystical encounters. Not that many psychologists really get on board with that. Modern psychologists, in my experience, most of the clinicians that I have as colleagues don't know what to do with this at all, right? If somebody starts having an experience of this kind, especially spontaneously, the answer is like medicate them, right? And in my opinion, it's like, no, these things are part of the human experience. They've always been part of the human experience, and it's clear that they can be a really important catalyst for growth that is not just a mental illness. But we don't have a good framework to process them anymore. We don't really have the resources. We don't have a shaman. We don't have clerics and priests that are really trained in this stuff. We don't have mystics to guide us. And so the way that I see it is, getting an increasing sense of how these things work will allow us to sort of bring psychedelics into a therapeutic framework, but in turn, finding a cognitive science inflected version of neo-Jungian theory with which to explain and engage and give us some way of understanding what's happening around it, I think will sort of help us incorporate this stuff and feel comfortable with it, but also give us access to a sense of the sacred through these things that's very difficult to get for many people otherwise. Does that answer the question?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it does. I would like to ask you if there is any place that on the internet people could find some of your work, your writings, to find more about your laboratory.
Right. So we have a few papers in the pipe that are coming up for publication. You can try searching for my name, I guess, but because my first name is Anderson and my last name is Todd, which conventionally are my last name is a first name and my first name is a last name. So I'm almost internet invisible. Sometimes that's useful and sometimes it's not. I just try to sell Anderson like Anderson Cooper or Anderson like Anderson Silva. Those guys have helped me a lot. If you Google me, we have some papers coming in publication. I have a few talks on YouTube, which are things that I've delivered at conferences. So I have one about some of my theory and stuff around Iboga that people have found interesting. And you can find our website at www.cwsl.ca. So that's our lab website. And I'm available at the University of Toronto. Generally speaking, if people drop me a line, I tend to be a pretty busy guy, but I'm always interested in, people that are interesting and pointing towards stuff. And to be honest, I'm so interested in this stuff that it's hard for me not to get engaged in it. So yeah, if you want to try to track me down that way. And I'm in the middle of working on a book, but the way that books go, it's hard to say when that will actually happen, so it remains to be seen. And it looks like maybe some of my classes are going to be posted up. There's some question about doing video recording in my courses this year. So if so, then my courses would go up. I think I'm also maybe doing a guest episode on John Vervaeke's podcast, which he's been releasing the Meaning Crisis podcast in installments. So I think we're doing a set of guest episodes, but I'm not certain when that it is either. We've both been crazy busy over the summer. So, yeah.
Okay. Just following up, and for your book that you're working on, when would you be able to talk about it? If you would like to come to this podcast as well, so it would be great to have you again.
I can tell you a little bit about it now. So it's in the formative stages. So I don't want to be too definitive. Primarily speaking, it's going to be an attempt to integrate a lot of the work I've done over the last decade around, for lack of a better term, magic. So I'm very interested in cultural practices around magic. Unlike a lot of the colleagues that I've talked to, I don't think that magic is just a question of superstition. I think that lots of traditional magical practices and developed magical practices are, like meditation and like other forms of trance work and so on and so forth, really actually highly sophisticated tools. They're like a highly sophisticated set of sort of therapeutic and self-transcending and self-operating tool. So I've done a lot of theoretical work around meshing together sort of traditional techniques of magic and trying to figure out what those mean in terms of cognitive science. So that's a big part of it, is explicating my theory of magic, which I've been working on with a few colleagues. John Vervaeke, I've gotten him, I finally convinced him after a number of years of debating about it that magic was worth looking at. So he's now very into this. And our colleague Junsung Kim, who likewise has become very interested in what he calls the psychology of sorcery. And so we have a few colleagues. Daniel Grieg is a student at the university who's also interested in this area. So a bunch of us have been talking. We've had a working group. I have been doing my own work in the area, and so I've sort of been looking to put that. And then I'm actually consolidating that together. This is harder to explain. I'm consolidating that together with a bunch of the theory that I've been working on around the relationship between cognitive science and role-playing games. So I do a bunch of work around, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, and what exactly is going on in those games, which, if people are familiar with them, are raise a lot of questions when you begin to look at them in a kind of analytical way. And so there's a kind of rich field of interactions between role-playing games, cognitive science, Jungian theory, magic, and sort of altered states, et cetera, and I'm knitting those things together into a more unified theory. But We'll see. Writing is often time-consuming and very frequently surprising. So, but I'll certainly let you know if I'm in the space to sort of discuss that. Although I'm happy to talk about the theory. I've given a bunch of talks on aspects of this, and I teach it in my courses.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. For the last questions, I was happy fire questions. The first one is, what is your favorite book?
Oh boy, fiction or nonfiction?
You choose.
Or fiction, nonfiction, or scripture. I feel like those are the categories. Okay, that's a toughie. My favorite novel, I think, of all time. I would have said Gravity's Rainbow by Pynchon, but I think that's not actually true. I think my favorite novel of all time is Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. I have like 4 copies of it in hardcover. I don't even know why. It's one of those books I keep buying even though I already own it. Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco is a tremendous novel, and it's just an absolute rabbit hole of sort of the history of Western esoteric thought, but also paranoid thought process. And Umberto Eco is just always a joy. He's a cognitive science novelist. And if people have read Name of the Rose, right, which is his book as well, it's like that, except about occult magic material. That's a tremendous book. And let me think. Geez, nonfiction, if I have to make a recommendation. Certainly one of the most influential books that I ever read was Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. The thing about it is it was super influential on me when I was 16 and I read it, but it's quite dated now. It was published in 1977. Maybe Waking, Dreaming, Being by Evan Thompson. That's a heck of a book. I would recommend that to almost anybody. Let me think. Oh, I know. The Perennial Philosophy. Aldous Huxley. That book's always good. Every single time I come back to it, it's like, wow, I should read this. I should read this book every day. Yeah. Oh, and of course, the works of Jung. I have to put in a note for those. Those are just like part of the wallpaper of my mind at this point. But the works of Jung certainly are terrifically influential on me, especially his work around alchemy. But any of that stuff, if you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which is sort of his autobiography, it's a really good, accessible introduction to Jung. There, I cheated. I gave you 5 books.
Thank you. And what's your favorite movie?
Oh, that one's easy. My favorite movie of all time is John Carpenter's 1982 version of The Thing. I'm a big horror movie guy. I love horror movies. And I love horror movies, and I think The Thing is possibly the perfect horror movie.
Why?
Yeah.
Why?
Okay. So lots of modern movies, it seems to me, spend a lot of time messing around. They have unnecessary extra bits. They have 4 endings. Movies from that period were very straightforward. They just took you through the moves, right? They were lean. The movie would run like 90 minutes, right? That movie hits what I call the 3 M's of horror, especially effectively. And the 3 M's of horror in terms of plot are madness, mutilation, and mutation. Now, the reason that those 3 things are so effective, and it combines it with isolation, the whole thing is set in Antarctica, and the special effects are the best that 1982 could produce. So they're sort of the very limit of pre-digital effects. Computer graphics do not play a significant role, but the work that they do with latex and so on and so forth is just astounding, right? So it's really gross. It's a grisly film. If people don't like kind of body horror, it won't appeal to them. But if they do, it's a beautiful film. I mean, beautiful, it's gross. But so those 3 M's, I'm interested in horror movies because horror movies, unlike, most horror movies aren't horror movies, right? They are terror movies. They're about shocks and punctures. A good horror movie should undermine your sense of the real. And so in a way that gradually causes you to question things. Jacob's Ladder is a terrific horror movie because you start to wonder what you're even dealing with. And The Thing is so good in this respect because it starts to just pull out your assumptions. Who is in on it? Who is the monster? Who isn't? And what's happening? And it keeps all of it in a very tight bottle. It's claustrophobic. So yeah, I love that film.
Wonderful. Your favorite hobby?
Role playing, without question. I like motorcycles. I like to cook. I like lots of things. I have a lot of hobbies, but I've been playing role-playing games for 35 years now. I run quite a bit, so I use quite a few. I do lots of it. I run lots of games and have done for many years, and I've become very interested in sort of the literary aspects of role-playing as an art form. But role-playing games, without question, is my favorite hobby.
An inspirational person.
So to call back to Aldous Huxley, I've always found Aldous Huxley to be quite inspirational. I've been doing a returned kick, though, lately on Alan Watts. I was really into Alan Watts, years ago when I was like 20, and for some reason I've been on an Alan Watts kick lately, listening to him. And he's so delightful. His sort of appreciation for the mystical, but also the lightness that he brings to it, right? He doesn't have that kind of heavy quality in explaining it. So, you can hardly go wrong with Alan Watts or Aldous Huxley.
Great. A place you would like to visit?
I'd like to go to Antarctica, ideally without monsters. But I would really like to see Antarctica. I've seen so many photos, and it looks like a place of just like unearthly beauty, and really one of the few places on Earth that is not crawling with other humans. Not that I mind humans, I like humans. I would definitely like that. And I've recently I want to go to Tibet. I've been right to the edge. I lived in India for a while, and so I was right on the edge. I was in Dharamshala, where the Tibetan community in exile is, the Dalai Lama and so on and so forth, but I didn't ever cross into Tibet. So I've been thinking about Tibet a lot, but I want to see it all.
And finally, a meaningful life for me is?
Oh, that's a good question. A meaningful life for me. A meaningful life for me is an opportunity to explore the world and understand things, but moreover to share that exploration and that understanding and to help people more than anything. I love writing. I was a professional writer for years. I wrote fiction, love writing, like storytelling. I love to teach. I love those aspects of things. I do consulting work, but the therapeutic work that I do is without question one of the most enriching, meaningful, professions possible. If you have the temperament for it, and not everybody does, it's not everybody's cup of tea. But if you do, the opportunity to have that kind of relationship and do that kind of work, to walk with somebody through, their suffering and their transformation and their growth, and move with them through life, is just one of the most profoundly affecting experiences there is. I feel tremendous gratitude, actually, to be able to do it for a living. So yeah, a meaningful life for me is that, helping people.
Thank you. Anderson Todd, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Leandro. I enjoyed it a great deal.